couple years back, I came across this survey dealing with the subject of vocations. And it had a lot of interesting points, but one particular point I always remembered, they were talking about vocations to the priesthood. And so basically the point was this: of those surveyed, at least 3% of Catholic men at some point in their lives had very seriously considered a vocation to the holy priesthood. Now, you hear 3% doesn't sound like all that much until you do the math, right? And so imagine this parish, St. James in Colgan, Ontario, right? So roughly 500 people. It's actually more, but it makes the math easier when you say 500, right? So let's presume it's a packed house. It's presuming a lot. So if you do the math, what the survey seems to be suggesting is that at a particular mass with that particular composition, there would be at least 6 or 7 guys who at some point in their lives had very seriously considered a vocation to the holy priesthood. And at the very least, it forces us to reconsider what we typically hear. So oftentimes what you hear with regards to vocations and vocations to the priesthood is you're looking for that one vocation, right? So every parish has that one vocation. Who is it? What's it going to be? How can we nurture and cultivate that one vocation? Why don't we set the bar a little bit higher, you know? Instead of like one vocation, what about like 3? What about 4? What about 5? What are we supposed to do? What can we do to further cultivate the fruition of these potential vocations, right? So given all that, what I want to do today is talk about discernment, issues related to discernment, particularly as it pertains to the holy priesthood. So in a certain sense, this is like spiritual direction from afar. I'm just betting on the fact that there are certain guys out there who are thinking about the holy priesthood, so certain issues might come to mind in that regard, so we're going to address those things one at a time. So first of all, obviously, if you're discerning something like the holy priesthood, you need to have a serious habit of prayer and a deep immersion in the sacraments. On that note, I remember the first time I met my first spiritual director. We were talking about a bunch of stuff, and he quickly picked up on the fact that I didn't know my faith and I wasn't praying worth a lick. And so what he said was like, look, what I want you to do, just pray with the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, take your pick, for 5 minutes a day. In response to which, I thought to myself, 5 minutes? That's a lot. Certainly there is the ideal. Right? So if you're discerning like the holy priesthood, obviously you can't just do 5 minutes, so you need to amp it up, right? So the ideal is something like a holy hour every day, right? So 60 minutes before the Lord, ideally before the Lord in the Blessed Sacrament, right? Not to mention the Rosary, not to mention spiritual reading, like this habit of reading books by Catholic authors or saints, right? So there's that. It also presumes this deep immersion in the sacraments, especially Mass, especially the Sacrament of Confession. So try to go to Mass every day, try to receive the Sacrament Confession at least once a month, if not more frequently, right? But the underlying point is this: you want to start with something small and manageable, because what you're shooting for is consistency. You don't want to start from like 0 and go to like 100 just because you feel guilty that you never prayed worth a lick for years, right? What you want to do is start with something small that you can keep up over a long period of time, something like 5 minutes of the Gospel and kind of building up from there. So that's like, prayer and the sacraments. Now, the big elephant in the room in terms of like issues with regards to, discernment, celibacy, the big celibate elephant in the room, right? So a couple of preliminary comments with regards to that. You need to have the grace. So if you're called to the celibate life, God will give you the grace. So you need to discern that particular thing. Is that my vocation? If it is, God will give you the corresponding grace. The example that comes to mind, I remember there was this bishop from, I think, outside the diocese. He was talking to us in a seminary. And the way he framed it was kind of funny. He's like, look, if you guys are living a celibate vocation and you're in the seminary, right? Certainly celibacy is difficult, but if you find that you're white-knuckling it, like all the time, and waking up in cold sweats thinking, oh my goodness, I'm celibate, you're probably not called to the celibate life. Right? So you got to discern that, right? So with grace and with time and information, can I live the celibate life peacefully? And not everyone can. Not everyone has the grace because not everyone is called to that. That said, I've always found for myself, the issue with celibacy is not primarily a physical thing. It's a psychological or mental or cultural thing. So a lot of times what happens, we kind of give into the lies and deceptions of the world with regards to sexuality. A lot of times the real problem when it comes to even considering the celibate life, or even living a life of chastity for that matter, a lot of times we give in into the lies and deceptions and the wickedness of the world with regards to sexuality. So as it applies to young men, what do you hear in the culture? Unless you're acting out sexually in terms of a physical thing, unless you got a pretty girl in your arm telling you you're great and wonderful and whatever, you are, a loser, right? And so the question is, what do you do with that? This point might sound controversial, but it really isn't, right? Guys, women don't exist to make you feel better about yourself. Women do not exist to make you feel better about yourself. It's not their fault if you're feeling bad about yourself. It's not a responsibility to make you feel better. They're simply people like you and me. That might be a shock, but actually it's true, right? And what are people called to do? People are called to respond to us in the moment, to respond to our pain, but never to take responsibility for us. And what that means, practically speaking, is like, don't expect things from other people, men or women, that you don't expect from the Lord. Jesus Christ alone is the way and the truth and the life. So if you're looking for meaning and purpose and identity, look to Jesus alone as opposed to someone who's a fellow sojourner in terms of the pilgrim journey. So really important to know. But it goes to a deeper issue, right? So when you kind of examine your life, like, how is it that I live my life? And more to the point, like, how is it that you're trying to find joy and happiness and peace and, the realization of all the deep desires of your heart? The way I like to frame it in my own mind is to kind of ask myself, like, what kind of lover am I? And we oscillate between the right answer and the wrong answer. So is my love a giving love, or is my love a taking love? Is my love a giving love, or is my love a taking love? And the thing I want to suggest to you, regardless of what your vocation might be, if you try to find joy and happiness and peace by taking, it's never going to work. You will always be frustrated, and the celibate life will always seem incomprehensible. Never mind the general call to chastity. So that's something you need to work out. It's one thing to hear, like in the Protestant church, we're called to be persons of love and imitate God who is love, but when you go out there and you live your life, the rubber hits the road. Like, is my love a giving love or a taking love, right? And that's something you need to resolve, fundamentally speaking, regardless of what your particular vocation might be. Okay, final thing. I've always found my biggest issue with regards to discernment is this notion of self-acceptance. Self-acceptance. So on this note, I remember talking to a good friend of mine who's now a priest, but we were in a seminary together, and he knew me really well. I wouldn't ask this question of someone who didn't know me, right? So I remember asking him, like, buddy, I feel like I'm struggling a lot, and it's manifesting in all sorts of different ways. What do you think my issue is? And he didn't hesitate, which made me wonder, right? But he was like, your issue, Eric, is that you can't forgive yourself for being you. Your big issue is that you can't forgive yourself for being you. And it's not like deep and dark sins from the past. It wasn't that. It was this thing where it's just like, okay, Lord, I think you're calling me to the holy priesthood, but if you're calling me to be a priest, why would you make me me? And if you want me to be someone else who's like basically not me, to be a priest, what does that mean for me right now? Does that mean you don't accept me? Does that mean you're not really my friend? Does that mean you don't really love me? And so that's awful to think about. So I felt like I was kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. We can all relate to this on some level, right? In retrospect, I was laboring under this really false and extremely narrow and made up notion of what it means to be holy or what it means to be a priest. And we all fall into this, right? What does it mean to be holy? It means you walk a certain way, you talk a certain way, you live a certain way, all kind of made up, external trappings, things that we kind of put on ourselves that God doesn't really expect, It took me forever. It took me forever to realize God was not calling my ideal self, wasn't calling my perfect self, wasn't calling my refined self. Surprise, surprise, the Lord was always calling me, the real me, the broken me, the person who's always in the process of becoming. It goes to the foundational mystery of the Incarnation. The Incarnation is one of my favorite mysteries. It's not simply an Advent or a Christmas thing. This is like an identity thing. What does the Incarnation tell us? It invites us to dispel our lies about our relationship with God. Again, I'm sure you can relate to this. We often fall into this notion that, okay, someday maybe, one day in the future, I will be virtuous, I'll be perfect, or maybe even simply good. And then God will accept me, and then God will love me, and then He'll call me to great things. And the Incarnation says, while we were sinners, Jesus Christ in His great humility and love came down to us and journeyed with us through our brokenness, through our sinfulness, through our frailty. And if we have the corresponding humility to receive that, in that space is the marriage of humanity and divinity. Now, all these things we're talking about, hopefully you see that they don't strictly apply to guys who are discerning the priesthood. They apply to everyone, right? We're talking about rules of discernment, and we're touching on Advent spirituality. I know we're safely in ordinary time, but this is irrelevant, right? What does the season of Advent remind us of? It's not like, again, someday maybe God's grace and His presence will be obtained by us. It's like right now. Right now there's God's presence. Right now there's God's grace. So what do? I remove obstacles. I instill good habits that facilitate the reception of His grace. So, listen to the voice of the Good Shepherd. Say no to the lies and deceptions of the evil one. So a habit of prayer. Encounter the Lord through the sacraments, especially the Eucharist, especially the sacrament of confession. And build your life around giving as opposed to taking. And then what happens? When you do that, your heart very naturally goes to where it's dying to go. When you do that, the heart very naturally goes to where it's dying to go. And you will discover in retrospect that all this time, your vocation was never a reward for good behavior. It was never simply an add-on to your already inconvenient life. Your vocation always is a deepening of who you already are and who you're dying to become.